The bar was so loud Corinne felt it in her teeth, and afterward she would remember thinking, right before her palm cracked across the stranger's face, that her mother had been wrong all these years. She wasn't cautious. She wasn't sensible. She was the kind of woman who would hit a man twice her size in a King Street club without knowing his name. She'd come for Talia. Her phone had lit up 20 minutes earlier with a text that made no sense, half a word, then nothing, and Corinne had left her cold ramen on the counter and taken a streetcar and then just run, coat open in the January slush. When she finally found the private booth at the back, Talia was slumped sideways, eyes glassy, and a man in a dark blazer had one hand at her waist, leaning in. Corinne didn't think. She grabbed his shoulder, spun him and hit him. "Get your hands off her." Her voice came out ragged. "What did you give her? What did you do?" He didn't hit back. He didn't even shout. He just looked at her, one cheek going red, with an expression she couldn't read at all. Surprise maybe, and underneath it something almost amused, and she didn't wait around to interpret it. She hauled Talia up, got an arm under her, and half carried her out into the freezing night to flag a cab. Her heart going so hard, she thought she might be sick right there on the sidewalk. The next morning she was late, and the whole studio had gathered in the big south-facing boardroom, because it was the day Meridian Design House introduced the man who'd just bought a controlling stake and taken over as its chief executive. Corinne slid into the back with a lukewarm double-double and her hair still damp. The managing director cleared his throat, said they were fortunate, said please welcome. And the man who walked through the glass door, with a folder under his arm and a faint bruise along his jaw, was the man she had slapped 9 hours earlier. He found her in the crowd almost at once. She watched the recognition move across his face and settle into something that was not anger. He smiled, just slightly. The kind of smile a person gives when the universe has handed them something they intend to enjoy. Corinne's coffee went cold in her hand. His name was Silas Renner. He was 34, and he had a habit, she would learn, of saying exactly what he meant and then waiting, patiently, while everyone else caught up. That first day, she spent trying to become invisible, which is difficult when you are the person who assaulted the boss. And by 4 o'clock she had convinced herself she'd be walking out with a cardboard box. He didn't fire her. He didn't mention it. He toured the design floor, asked good questions, remembered names, and when he passed her workstation, he paused just long enough to glance at the walnut sideboard she'd been detailing and say, "This is nice work," and move on. And she sat there furious at herself for how much the small approval landed. She should explain about the club, she knew. She hunted down Talia at lunch. They'd shared a rented half-house in Leslieville for 3 years, the two of them splitting hydro and groceries and their mother-shaped anxieties, and Talia, pale and hungover, remembered almost nothing. "I was with a work friend, I think," and then it gets fuzzy. "God, Cor, I'm sorry you had to come get me." She pressed her cold hands to her face. "Someone must have put something in my drink." "I hit the guy," Corinne said. "I really hit him, and now he owns the company." Talia stared. Then, incredibly, she laughed. "You're kidding, Silas? Silas Renner? You know him?" "I've known him since I was 12. Talia's eyes had gone bright in a way Corinne didn't fully register at the time. "Our families are, it's complicated. His mom and my mom did the whole Rosedale Garden Club thing together. I basically grew up in his kitchen." She shook her head, delighted. "You slapped Silas. This is the best thing that's ever happened." So it had been a misunderstanding. Corinne learned the shape of it in pieces over the following week. That Silas had been at the club that night for a colleague's send-off. That he'd seen a woman about to slide off a banquette and had gone to keep her upright. That he'd been in the middle of calling her a cab when a stranger with wet hair came flying out of nowhere and clocked him. He told her all this himself, eventually, cornering her by the good espresso machine on the 4th floor. "For the record," he said, "I've never in my life put anything in anyone's drink." "For the record," she said, "you had your arm around her. She was falling over." He considered her. Most people would have apologized by now. Most people didn't watch a man leaning over their unconscious friend. She lifted her chin. "I'd do it again." Something in his face shifted, warmed. "I believe you," he said, and walked off before she could decide whether she'd won or lost. Corinne was 29 and she had built her life on purpose, brick by brick, precisely so that no man would ever get to be the load-bearing wall. She'd watched her aunt in Bobcaygeon flinch every time her uncle raised his voice. She'd watched 2 of her closest friends from school marry young and unravel. One of them back at her parents' place within a year, kids in tow. Her own mother phoned every Sunday like clockwork, and every Sunday the call bent, eventually, toward the same subject. "Your cousin's expecting again," her mother said that week. "And you're going to be 30 in the fall, Corinne." I'm aware of my own birthday, Mom. Grandma's memorial lunch is next month. Everyone will ask. You could at least bring someone. I'm not bringing anyone because there isn't anyone, and there isn't going to be anyone. I like my life. She was cradling the phone against her shoulder, sketching. I make good money. I have a house I love. I don't have to run home to my parents when somebody's mother makes me miserable. You are the most stubborn girl God ever made. I learned it somewhere. Her mother sighed the particular sigh she'd been perfecting for 29 years. Just come home for the lunch. And if by some miracle there's a young man, you bring him. Corinne said she'd think about it, which they both understood to mean no, and hung up, and did not think about it. She thought instead, against her will, about the way Silas Renner had said, I believe you. The spring collection launched in April, and it did better than anyone had projected. A line of solid oak modular pieces that photographed like nothing else on the market, and the accounts told the design team the campaign had brought in more revenue in 6 weeks than the whole previous year. To market, the studio booked out a room at a place downtown, and Corinne, who did not want to spend an evening in a club ever again as long as she lived, was dragged there anyway by Josie, who did the textiles and refused to take no for an answer. Silas came. Nobody expected him to. Josie had sent the invite up to the executive floor out of politeness. But there he was, in a plain white shirt and no tie, and every junior designer in the room straightened up at once. He said a few gracious words about the team's work, told them the night was on him, and then, out of a dozen empty chairs, he sat down in the one beside Corinne. There are other seats, she said. There are, he agreed, and stayed. She drank more than she meant to. She'd never had a head for it. 2 glasses and the room went soft at the edges, and the team kept toasting her, because the oak line had been half her doing. And every time she set a glass down, someone filled it. At one point Silas reached over, as if to take the next one from her hand, and she batted him off out of sheer contrariness and downed it herself, and he sat back and watched her with a patience that made her want to throw something. By the time the party talked about moving on, Corinne could barely stand. She heard Josie ask if she was all right and heard her own answer come out slurred and useless. And then Silas was on his feet, saying he'd see her home, telling the others to stay and enjoy themselves, and she was too far gone to argue. She gave him her address in the cab of her own memory, and remembered almost nothing after. He told her the rest, much later, laughing, how she'd fallen asleep against the window, how he hadn't had the heart to wake her, how he'd draped his jacket over her because she'd started to shiver, and how, when he'd finally leaned across to rouse her at her door, she'd opened her eyes, taken his face in both her hands and kissed him, then let go, settled back, and gone straight back to sleep as if nothing had happened at all. He walked her up. He rang the bell. And Talia opened the door in a silk robe, her whole face lighting when she saw who it was, and her smile faltering only when she saw who he was holding up. Silas. What? When did you get back? Then, sharper, why do you have Corinne? She works for me, he said evenly. She had too much to drink at the team dinner. I was on my way through. He transferred Corinne carefully into Talia's arms. Look after her. Talia's hand went to her collar, adjusting the robe, but he was already turning to go. Wait, it's been ages, come in for a bit. Not tonight, he said. I've still got work. Corinne remembered none of it. She woke at 7 with a skull full of gravel and a memory that stopped at the club door. Talia was already gone. She dragged herself to the studio because it was Monday, and she made it as far as the elevator, and the doors were sliding shut when she jammed her hand in and stepped through. And the only other person inside was Silas. He was smiling at the cut on his own lip in the mirrored wall, and all at once it came back to her. Her hands on his face, her mouth on his. Heat flooded up her neck. Feeling better, he said, and rested the back of his hand against her forehead the way you'd check a child for fever. She jerked away. I'm fine, you don't have to do that, so. His voice dropped, amused. You take advantage of a man and then act like it never happened. Take advantage. The doors opened onto her floor and she practically fell out of the elevator, and she could feel him grinning at her back the whole way down the hall. She got nothing done that day. She kept replaying it and knocking the heel of her hand against her own forehead. He thinks I'm in love with him now. She stayed late to make up for the lost hours, and by 7 the floor was dark except for the drafting lamps, and when a hand closed around her wrist from behind, she gasped hard enough to hurt. Just me, Silas said. Why are you still here? Why are you? He didn't answer that. Have you eaten? Let me take you somewhere. I'm not hungry. Her stomach chose that exact moment to growl loudly, and he had the decency to pretend to study the ceiling. Fine, she muttered, but I'm getting my own cab home. He took her to a small Portuguese place near the studio, ordered too much of everything because he didn't know what she liked, and peeled a shrimp and set it on her plate before she could stop him. She meant to be cool. She wasn't sure, driving home afterward with the city lights sliding across the windshield, why she'd said yes at all, only that there was a warmth in her chest she had no filing system for. This was the part she should have seen coming, and didn't, because when he pulled up to the house, Talia was on the front steps, home late from somewhere, and her whole face changed when she saw whose car it was. "You two know each other?" Corinne said, confused, looking between them. "For years," Talia said quickly. "We're close." She tucked herself neatly under Silas's attention, tugged him toward the door, insisted he come in for tea, and he sat on their Chesterfield for exactly one polite cup while Talia perched beside him too near, and then he left. The moment the door shut, Talia turned. "Are you and Silas together?" "What?" "No." Corinne laughed, but it came out thin. "You know how I feel about all that." Talia's shoulders came down, and then she grabbed Corinne's hands, bright again. "Okay, can I tell you a secret?" A pause, a breath. "I like him. I've liked him forever. And now he's right here in our lives, and I think, I really think I could make him mine." Something went very quiet and very heavy inside Corinne's chest. She smiled anyway. "I thought you two were basically family. Our families are close." "That's not the same as related." Talia's eyes shone. "A man like that deserves someone who's known him her whole life." "That's me. It was always going to be me." So Corinne did the only thing she knew how to do. She stepped back. She started sending Josie up with the reports instead of taking them herself. She found reasons to be in the fabrication shop whenever Silas came down to the floor. She would not be the thing that broke a 9-year friendship, and if there was a small, insistent ache somewhere under her ribs, every time she thought of shrimp on her plate, she ignored it the way she ignored her mother's Sunday sighs. It lasted about 2 weeks. Then Silas called her extension and told her, flatly, to come to his office, and when she couldn't invent another excuse, she went. "You've been avoiding me," he said. "I've been busy. You send Josie up with things you used to bring yourself." He came around the desk. "I'm asking you to a thing on Saturday, a gala, fashion and design people, the whole crowd." He held out a heavy cream envelope. "Come with me." "Why me? Where's your date?" "I don't have one." He looked at her without a flicker of doubt. "Because I want to go with you." She had no answer for that. His assistant took over the rest, a stylist, a fitting, a floor-length black gown, with a scatter of crystals that caught the light when she moved. When she stepped out of the dressing room, Silas actually went still, and she felt her face go warm and reached, uselessly, to adjust a neckline that didn't need adjusting. The gala was in a hotel ballroom near the harbor, and men she didn't know kept glancing at her, and every time they did, Silas somehow ended up a half-step closer. He worked the room. Meridian's partners were everywhere, but he kept coming back. When her borrowed heels started to blister her, he wrapped up a conversation mid-sentence and steered her out early. And in the car there was a huge bunrily bunch of deep red roses on the seat between them. He put them in her hands. "These are for you." "Why, Corinne?" He turned to face her fully. "Will you be my girlfriend?" She covered her mouth. And then, because she was who she was, the very next thought that surfaced was Talia's face lit up on the front steps. "I can't," she whispered. "Talia, she cares about you so much. I won't do that to her." Silas shook his head slowly. "The person I want is you. Do you honestly think Talia loves me? Or does she love the version of me that comes with the house in Rosedale and the family name? That's not fair. You don't see her the way I do." He reached over and took one of her hands, roses and all. "I couldn't tell you when it started. Somewhere along the way you got into my chest and I couldn't get you out. Every single day I've been making up reasons to see you." His thumb moved over her knuckles. "You broke something in me the night you hit me. You may as well take responsibility for it." She looked at him in the dark of the car, at this careful, patient, stubborn man, and every wall she'd been building since she was a girl in Bobcagian, watching her aunt flinch, just held its breath. He leaned in and kissed her, and this time she was completely sober and she did not pull away. She was still floating when they reached the house, and Talia was standing at the top of the steps with her arms rigid at her sides, and she had seen everything. "What," Talia said, "was that?" Corinne opened her mouth. Talia didn't let her get a word out. "Who swore she'd never date anyone? Who told me, to my face, she wasn't interested in him?" Her voice climbed. She crossed the space between them and gripped Corinne's shoulders hard. "I told you I loved him. I told you. How could you? Please, it wasn't planned. I watched you kiss him." Talia shoved her, and Corinne's palms scraped the concrete as she went down. "We're done. Do you hear me? We are done." She grabbed her keys and was gone into the night before Corinne could get up off the step. She didn't come home. Corinne called and texted, and finally called Silas, near tears, and he found out within the hour that Talia was safe. staying at his sister Anouk's condo across town. That should have been a relief. Mostly it felt like the floor had come out from under a friendship she'd assumed was permanent. She took a few days off without telling Silas and drove up the 115 to Bobcagian, to her parents' place, and her mother opened the door and couldn't quite hide her disappointment that Corinne had come alone. But she saw how wrung out her daughter looked, and for once, didn't push. She carried Corinne's bag inside and put the kettle on. The town did what it always did. The lake was still half frozen, but the air had that first green smell to it, and after 2 days the knot in Corinne's chest loosened, and then a new feeling moved into the space where it had been, one she turned over and over, baffled. She missed him. However busy he was, Silas called every night before bed, asked when she was coming back, and every night she gave him some vague answer and left him hanging, and every night she noticed how much she wanted to hear his voice. One bright morning she finally made herself get up and out. She rounded up a couple of old high school friends for coffee at the place on the main drag. And of course the conversation swung within 20 minutes to when Corinne was finally going to settle down. She'd only just started seeing someone, and she'd never once let herself imagine a wedding. And yet the thought arrived, sudden and strange and not at all unpleasant, that maybe she was exactly the age where a person did start to picture these things. She got back to her parents' driveway near noon and found a car she half recognized parked out front. Some sleek thing Silas had probably owned for a week. He changed cars the way other people changed toques. Inside, her mother's laugh was ringing out of the kitchen. Corinne walked in to find Silas at the table in a dark blazer, gift bags stacked at his feet, her father across from him looking pleased, in a way he almost never let himself look. He stood to greet her. Her mother waved him back down. "Leave her be, our future son-in-law. She's been home 4 days and never said a word about you." "Mom," Corinne stared, "we just started dating. I have not agreed to marry anyone," Silas said with wounded theatricality. That's not what I meant." Her mother flapped a dish towel. "Your father and I have talked it all through with him. His people are coming up next month to sit down properly. The sooner the better. Don't you, Mom, me? You'll be 30 in October." There was no winning it. Corinne dropped into the chair beside Silas, and he tried and failed to hide a grin. And by that afternoon half of Bobcagian had heard that the Corinne who was never going to marry anyone had brought home a young man, and her mother told the story to the cashier at the Foodland, and the woman at the post office, and anyone else who'd stand still for it. Prouder than she'd been the day Corinne got her degree. Because she still felt sick about Talia, Silas suggested she move in with him. He didn't want her under the same roof as someone who'd shoved her onto concrete. So when she came back down to the city, she made up her mind to pack. Talia was there when she came for her things, and the resentment came off her like heat. She'd taken scissors to half of Corinne's clothes. Good pieces, things Corinne had made herself, sliced through at the shoulders and left in a heap. She'd emptied the joint account they'd kept for the house since the first year, the one they'd both been feeding a little into every payday, cushion money, someday money. She'd hauled boxes of Corinne's belongings out onto the porch. Corinne stood in the wreck of the room she'd shared a home from for 3 years and felt the last of her guilt burn clean off. She had cleaned this house every week while Talia left her dishes. She had covered rent the 2 months Talia was between jobs. She had loved her like a sister, and now she looked at the ruined clothes and the drained account and thought, with a clarity that almost frightened her, thank God I didn't walk away from him for her sake. The happier Corinne and Silas got, the more Talia curdled, and Talia was clever about it. She still had Anouk's ear, Silas's younger sister who'd always looked up to her, and she began drop by patient drop to poison it. Corinne was a climber, she said. Corinne had latched onto Silas for the money, the name, the Rosedale house. Anyone could see it. She'd told Corinne herself, years ago, that she never wanted to marry. So why the sudden change the second a rich man appeared? Anouk heard it enough times that it started to sound like something she'd concluded on her own. And the closer the family's meeting came, the more anxious she got. She loved her brother. She'd watched him get burned young, a girl in his last year of school who'd cheated on him and left him convinced, for a long time, that love wasn't worth the risk. And she couldn't stand the thought of it happening again. The night before Silas's parents were to drive up to Bobcagian, Anouk sat her mother and father down and repeated all of it. Corinne was dishonest. Corinne only wanted the money. Their parents, who had liked what they'd seen, a sharp, warm, hard-working woman, hesitated, because Anouk looked so certain. Silas came through the front door in the middle of it and heard enough to understand. His face went dark. "Who told you this?" Anouk faltered. Talia, the disappointment in him was hard to watch. You're a grown woman. How did you let someone play you this easily?" His parents stepped in, told him to lower his voice. He was frightening his sister. He took a breath and told them everything instead. The rumors, the cut-up clothes, the emptied account, Talia driving Corinne out of her own home. And as the whole picture assembled itself, Anouk's eyes filled. She'd judged a woman she barely knew on one person's word, and she was ashamed. Silas softened because he could never stay angry at his sister for long. He put a hand on her head. "You got it wrong. Now you know better. That's the part that matters." His parents understood at last, and no one questioned Corinne again. Both families went back to planning a wedding. Corinne moved into Silas's place, and the two of them settled into a life that felt, for the first few months, like something out of a story she'd never let herself read. Quiet mornings, his coffee too strong, her sketches spread across his dining table, the slow luxurious ordinariness of being someone and having someone and not being afraid of it. Autumn came hard and beautiful that year. The maples up and down the street turned, and the mornings had a bite. The forecast warned of heavy rain, but Silas drove her out to the bridal salon anyway for the final fitting. Her gown had been made to her measurements down in Montreal, and the visit was really just to be sure nothing needed taking in. She stepped out from behind the curtain and he forgot how to speak. She looked, he told her, like something he wasn't allowed to have, and she laughed and told him not to cry in a bridal salon. It was undignified. He crossed the room and slid an arm around her waist and tucked a loose piece of hair back and kissed her, and for a second, the fitting room and the tailor and the whole gray afternoon just fell away. In 11 days they were going to be married on the shore of a lake in Prince Edward County. She was 29 and she had stopped, somewhere along the line, being the woman who braced for the worst. By the time they left the salon, dusk had come down early, and the rain had arrived with it, sheeting across the highway, headlights smearing through the wet dark. They drove north out of the city hand in hand, laughing about seating charts, about which of her cousins would cry first, and where the road bent, a transport truck came across the line into their lane far too fast, and Silas hauled the wheel, and it was already too late. The last thing Corinne knew was being pulled hard against his chest, and something warm soaking through her sleeve, and then nothing. 2 months later, the smell of disinfectant still hadn't left the room. Corinne sat by the bed the way she'd sat by it for weeks, thinner now, her eyes ringed with exhaustion. Silas hadn't woken. His signs had steadied long ago, but the head injury kept him under, and the life they'd been 11 days from starting had receded into somewhere she couldn't reach. He'd taken the worst of it, turning his body to shield her. She'd come out with a hairline fracture in her arm and a face full of small cuts that had healed to nothing. She worked when she had to, because rent and hydro didn't pause for grief, and every other hour she spent at his side, holding his hand, telling him about the lake, about the maples, about anything, waiting. That morning she'd had to go into the studio. Silas's parents were tied up. A hospital aide sat with him. And into that quiet mid-morning, Talia walked. She'd talked her way past the desk somehow. She stood over the unconscious man she'd wanted since she was 12, and looked down at him with an expression that had resentment, and something like tenderness tangled together in it. And she touched his face, and she leaned close and pressed her cheek to his, and stayed too long. Then she settled his hand in hers and smiled. His fingers moved. His eyes began to flutter. When the aide's call came, Corinne dropped everything and drove across the city with her heart in her mouth, and by the time she reached the ward, Silas's family had gathered outside the door, all of them lit up with relief. But what was inside the room stopped her cold. Silas was awake, propped against the pillows, and sitting beside him, holding his hand, was Talia. He looked at Corinne, and a small, confused ache flickered in his eyes, there and gone. And then he looked at her the way you'd look at a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong room. The doctors explained it carefully, afterward. The trauma had cost him a piece of his memory. Strangely, cruelly, the only piece missing was her, not his parents, not Anouk, not the company, not Talia, not his own childhood. Just Corinne, as if someone had reached in and lifted her clean out of him. No one on the team could say why. He went home a few days later, and he wanted her gone. His parents and Anouk sat him down and told him, again and again, that she was his fiancée, that they'd been days from a wedding and he couldn't make it fit. Her presence made him restless and cold. He moved his things into the spare room. He wouldn't share a space with a woman he was sure he'd never met. She stayed anyway, because his mother begged her to. Familiar faces, the doctors had said, sometimes helped. So Corinne cooked for a man who ate what she made without looking at her. She kept his prescriptions straight. She left the house before he woke, so he wouldn't have to see her at breakfast, and came back after dark, And the more gently she loved him, the further away he drifted. And there is no describing what it does to a person to nurse someone through the exact tenderness they've forgotten they ever felt. Talia, meanwhile, came by nearly every day. She fussed over Silas, laughed at everything he said, floated the idea that maybe she should move in to help look after him. And his parents shut that down flat, told her she would not be living there. And Talia hid the fury behind a bright smile and kept coming. And Silas, who remembered her, gave her whatever she asked. A necklace she admired out loud on a Tuesday appeared, wrapped, on the Wednesday. Dinner at the most expensive place in the city, candles, the whole production. He did it all, with the pleasant blankness of a man, following the only map he had left. And Talia mistook the blankness for winning. At that dinner she leaned over and murmured something to the server, and a bottle that had already been opened found its way to the table. After a few glasses, Silas felt the room start to tilt in a way that didn't match how little he'd had. Talia suggested, all concern, that they get him a room upstairs to rest, and he agreed, because she was the person he trusted, and she helped him to the elevator and into the room, and eased off his shoes, and reached for the top button of his shirt. And in the swimming half-dark, as Talia slipped out of her own coat and bent to kiss him, another face rose up in his mind. Not hers. A warm, wry, unguarded face. A woman knocking the heel of her hand against her forehead in an elevator. A woman in a black gown adjusting a neckline that didn't need it. A woman with her scraped palm and her chin up saying, "I'd do it again." The image came into focus with a sharpness that made him gasp, and a spike of pain went through his skull, and behind the pain the memories came pouring back all at once. Everything, all of it, her. He shoved Talia off and got to his feet, swaying, and walked out of the room. He didn't wait for the elevator. He flagged a cab on the wet street and gave his own address, and the whole way home there was only one person he needed to see. He went through the house calling her name, throwing open doors. She wasn't in the kitchen. She wasn't in the spare room he'd exiled himself to. It was past 9. Why wasn't she home? He pushed into the room that was supposed to be hers and stopped. It was nearly empty. Her clothes gone, her books gone, the sketches gone off the walls. On the dresser was a single folded note, and he picked it up with a hand that wouldn't stay steady. 3 words, in her small, even hand, "I'm letting go." It went through him like something with an edge. The proposal, the roses, the fitting room kiss, the 2 months she'd sat by a bed holding the hand of a man who looked at her like a stranger. All of it landed on him at once, and under it, worse. Every day he'd spent handing his warmth to Talia while Corinne cooked his supper and slipped out before he woke. He called her, over and over. Nothing. He called her mother and Bob Cagian. She'd never come. He called Josie, called the studio. No one had seen her. For the first time in his adult life, Silas had no idea what to do. Corinne at that moment was unconscious in a hospital across the city. She'd left the house with a single suitcase and made it 3 blocks before the world tilted, and she went down on the sidewalk. And it was strangers who'd found her and gotten her in. Her phone rang and rang in her bag until a nurse finally answered it, and when the nurse said the word family, Silas was already grabbing his keys. He drove like the traffic wasn't there. And when he came into that room and saw the woman he loved, the one who never sat still, who always had a pencil behind her ear, lying gray and motionless, something closed hard around his chest. He stood over her and said it again and again, low like a promise. "Wake up. I remember everything. I'm so sorry. I'm not losing you twice." Somewhere down in the dark she thought she heard a voice she knew by heart, warm, wrecked, certain. She surfaced slowly and there he was, and before she could get a word out he had her in his arms, and he was saying it into her hair, I remember all of it, I'm sorry." And 2 months of cold and doubt and quiet grief dissolved against his shoulder. Then the doctor came in with news neither of them expected. Corinne was pregnant. A little past 4 weeks, which put it before the crash, before the memory loss, back to a warm night the two of them had shared when they'd both had a bit too much. And he had, without knowing it, followed the thing in his chest he couldn't name. The child felt like something they hadn't earned and had somehow been given anyway. Silas pressed his mouth to her forehead and looked at her like a man surfacing into daylight. And she smiled back and let the whole terrible year fall away behind her. When both families heard that his memory had come home and that a baby was coming, they stopped waiting. And after a year that had taken so much, the wedding everyone had given up on finally happened. On the shore of a lake in Prince Edward County, under a clear October sky, the water going gold at the edges and the last leaves coming down around them. Corinne, who had spent her whole life certain she'd never do this, stood barefoot in the grass and traded rings and vows with the man she'd once slapped in a bar, and neither of them could stop laughing through it. The woman who was never going to marry anyone became, On a cold, bright afternoon with her mother crying in the front row, someone's wife, and the beginning of someone's mother, and unafraid. The truth about the crash came out because the police kept pulling the thread. The truck driver, cornered by the physical evidence and a witness who'd seen the whole thing, broke down and confessed he'd been paid. That a woman had hired him to run a black sedan off a wet highway on a specific evening. He gave them the name. It was Talia's. Faced with the confession and the money trail, she stopped denying it. And in front of Corinne, at the last, she admitted the rest of it too. That she'd stood over Silas in that hospital bed and done her level best to keep Corinne buried in the part of his mind that had gone dark. That she'd maneuvered and lied and drugged his wine, all to take the place she'd decided, since she was 12 years old, belonged to her. The court didn't call it a crime of the heart, it called it what it was. Talia was convicted of orchestrating the collision and sentenced to 12 years, and the joint account and the ruined clothes and the shoves on the porch were, next to that, almost too small to mention, except that Corinne did mention them, in a written statement, everyone, and saw to it that the record held the whole shape of what her oldest friend had done. Corinne thought about her for a long time after. Not to forgive her, exactly, but to understand her. And what she landed on was not that Talia had been born wrong. It was that wanting to own a person, wanting it badly enough and long enough, had hollowed something out in her until there was nothing left it wouldn't do. She had reached for a man who was never hers and, when she couldn't have him, had tried to erase the woman who did. And in the reaching, she'd thrown away her friend, her freedom, and whatever future she might have built if she'd ever once been able to open her hand. The 12 years were not only years, they were the rest of a life she'd have to spend alone with what she'd chosen. As for Corinne, she'd spent her whole life sure that standing on her own, needing no one, was the only safe way to live. And she'd been wrong, and she was glad to have been wrong. Silas had turned out to be, in the end, made of the same stubborn stuff she was. Someone who'd stopped believing in any of it, until the two of them, against every plan either had made, taught each other to believe again. She kept his coffee too strong. He learned to leave her sketches where they lay. And the following spring, in a hospital room that smelled, this time, only of something new beginning, she held their daughter against her chest and understood at last that the wall she'd spent so many years building had never been keeping the danger out. It had only ever been keeping her in.